Welcome to Judaism Demystified, a podcast for the perplexed. Join us as we explore some of the most fascinating Jewish and Torah-related topics with our esteemed guests. By tackling some of the biggest questions you likely won't find addressed elsewhere, we aim to shed light on important issues and inspire a return to the fundamentals. Enjoy the show. Thank you for joining the Judaism Demystified podcast. We are joined by Dr. Malka Simkovich again. Dr. Simkovich, we thank you so much for joining us again. We really had a blast with you the first time, and we actually had so much feedback. So many people messaged us, emailed us, sent us messages that they love this episode, and we have to have you on again. And we're so happy we're able to do this again. So if you could just tell our audience a little bit about yourself, if they had missed the first episode, and what you're up to.
That sounds great. First of all, it's good to see both of you. Thank you for having me back. I think that when we recorded that first podcast, I was a professor of Judaism at Catholic Theological Union, and I was the director of Catholic Jewish Studies there for 10 years. And I've left. I left a year ago. I'm now the editor-in-chief of the Jewish Publication Society and a visiting professor at Yeshiva University's Revel Graduate School for Jewish Studies. So a little bit of a pivot for me. I'm now facing the Jewish world and still having fun.
Beautiful.
Excellent. So we want to talk about your eye-opening book, Discovering Second Temple Literature. Why did you think it was so important to detail to the readers the events that surrounded the finding of the Cairo Genizah and Dead Sea Scrolls? And what did you hope the readers would take out of it?
First of all, I had a little bit of a thought that maybe opening up with some fun, intriguing journeys of discovery would grab the reader. So there's just the cheap answer that these are incredible stories of how modern scholars, explorers, religious leaders serendipitously came upon a body of literature that opened them up into this world of Second Temple Judaism that really was not a discipline. It was not a field until relatively recently. And entering into this world answered many questions about how we get from the world of the Tanakh, the world of the Hebrew Bible, or for Christians, the world of the Old Testament, into the world of the early Common Era. For Jews, that would be the world of the rabbis. For Christians, it would be the life of Jesus. But we're talking about 600 centuries, 600 years or so from the end of the Babylonian exile, which ends in around 538 BCE until the temple falls in 70 CE. That's a huge amount of time. Just to conceptualize how much time we're talking, think about before Shakespeare, right? You wouldn't understand the English that people spoke. Maybe there was some kind of English, but you wouldn't recognize that that society as belonging to you. I don't think. And again, of course, what society am I talking about? Shakespeare's England? Am I talking about other parts of Europe? I'm not even sure. But the point is that whatever the world looked like here in America or in Europe or elsewhere or in Israel, whatever the world looked like was totally different than the world that we know today. And sometimes we forget that and we think about this as an inconsequential era of Jewish history. We don't really need to know it. The literature that Jews produced during this time mostly was not canonized or preserved by the rabbis, therefore is of little or no religious value. And so what we do is we jump from the end of the Tanakh to the beginning of the rabbinic era, and we kind of connect those late biblical figures like Ezra and Daniel, to the world of the rabbis. And in doing so, we turn those late figures into essentially proto-rabbis. This is helpful in a way because we have this kind of vacuum, or at least a vacuum in our own minds of what takes place in between. But these stories are, again, incredible stories of discovery that also tell us how random and serendipitous and surprising and unpredictable the collection of data can be. This really is not a story of systematic research. And it reminds us that what we know today about the Second Temple era and other eras in Jewish history is really the product of a lot of serendipity and a lot of luck. And it also reminds us that there is so much that is lost. If we have a couple thousand pages of Jewish literature from the Hellenistic era that survived over 2 millennia, you can safely assume that there are hundreds of thousands of pages or millions of pages that were produced by Jews of a religious nature that were not preserved. So what we have is a reflection of serendipity, or you could say hashgacha, of luck. But I think it's humbling to know that probably there's more waiting to be discovered, or tragically, that will never be discovered.
Mm.
Yeah, and as I was going through those chapters, I believe it was 3 chapters. You have one on the Cairo Genizah, and then you have the fascinating situation with the monks and the monastery, if I'm not mistaken. And then going on to the Dead Sea Scrolls, like you could see, like the Ashkacha is like it's like a lot of things had to fall together. I really, really suggest that the readers get the book, and they'll enjoy these chapters, because you really get a inside look at exactly how much went down to get what we have in our possession today. It is truly incredible. Um,
And if it's okay, I would just jump in and add that a lot of the people who were involved in gathering these ancient texts, especially in the late 18th and 19th centuries, these were pious Christians, mostly
mhm.
Protestant Christians, who were interested in these texts because for them, these texts had religious value in that they informed the world about the life and times of Jesus. And so many of these texts, even the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered in the middle of the 20th century, were initially analyzed through the lens of early Christianity. But from the Jewish perspective, many of these texts actually testify to the piety and the continuity of Jewish tradition.
Yeah, and the third part of the book, and hopefully we'll talk a little about in the past in the podcast, when you go through all the different discoveries of different texts and testaments, and you see like a lot of like midrash and a lot of this type of stuff, you start to see how they kind of shaped off of each other. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
We'll get into that later on in the podcast. Um, I wanted to ask you about um what, to me, when I read it, it was truly incredible, um regarding the sheer volume of times that the Jewish people were faced with adversaries during the Second Temple period, the second part of your book. The Jews of Alexandria specifically, I wanted to ask you about, because the way you sketch the Second Temple history leaves one at a loss for words as to how Israel was able to survive that period, let alone have the temple stand for so long. One motif that strongly plays out in your presentation of its history is the unique standing of Jews as being citizens of their host empire while concurrently having limited sovereignty over Judea. It is demonstrated in your book that a lot of the hostilities were caused by the animosity and suspicion of what was perceived to be dual citizenship and dual loyalties privileged to the Jews. If you can discuss this recurring tension of identity, which both defined and challenged the Jewish people in the Second Temple period, I'd be grateful.
Um,
Long-winded, but I wanted people to get when I wrote the question, I wanted people to understand, the backdrop to the question.
to properly answer your question, I think there might have been a dozen questions in there. To properly answer the
Sure.
question, it would take a book length answer. So I'm going to instead try to give you some vignettes and feel free to cut in. If there's something I say that's interesting, you could just interrupt me and ask me to focus on that. So first of all, you mentioned that Jews were citizens in the Hellenistic world. That's a very tricky subject. The question of Greek and Roman citizenship is it's a complicated one, and many Jews enjoyed the privileges of living under their host empires, but not all of them had citizenship. So I'll put that aside. I mean, you're right to say that by the second century BCE, Jews live throughout the Hellenistic world. They live in North Africa. They live to the north of the land of Israel. They live in the Greek islands, they live in Italy, even going into Europe in the backwaters. They live up north. And of course, there's a whole community of Jews to the east along the Euphrates and Tigris. We don't have a good tracking of these Jews, but these are Jews who presumably never left that region following the Babylonian exile. And then that kind of reemerges into prominence in the rabbinic era. But the Jews who live, let's say, along what's called the Levant, along this Mediterranean coastal lines, it's true that they encounter extraordinary challenges, and I'll talk about that in a second. We also have to keep in mind that there must have been some good times, some opportunities for upward mobility. And we assume that because of the kind of shocking level of optimism that we find in some of the texts that are produced by Jews living outside the land of Israel, especially in Egypt. These are Jews who uncynically believe in the future of their communities. And in the notion that maybe today they're not accepted, but down the road, one day their neighbors will see and appreciate all the many contributions that the Jewish people make to their host empires. We also know that there were very powerful Jews in Egypt, especially in Ptolemaic Egypt, who rose the ranks of politics and the court. We know that there was a very influential family, the Onaids, Onias, Chonia is his Hebrew name, goes to Egypt from the land of Israel in the early 2nd century BCE. Very famously, he or his son build a temple in Egypt, but I wouldn't call him a heretic. We know, at least from Josephus and other sources, that he seems to have been pious, or at least observant of his ancestral laws. And Onias IV's sons, Chalkiah and Hananiah, are advisors to one of the queens named Cleopatra. We have other references to very influential Jews living in Egypt under Greek and Roman rule. Some of these Jews might have been observant, others were probably totally assimilated. Philo of Alexandria, a very famous philosopher who we have every reason to think observed his ancestral laws, observed Shabbat and Kashrut, and other practices, but he had a brother who was a very important politician in Egypt that likely abandoned his observance of Judaism. We have a letter written by authorities in Jerusalem to the Jews of Egypt at the end of the 2nd century BCE, imploring them to observe a holiday that will become known as Hanukkah. And this letter specifies that they're addressing the Jews of Egypt, but they're asking in particular a Jew named Aristobulus to read this letter. And Aristobulus is identified as the tutor of King Ptolemy, the tutor who is Jewish and works in the court of the king named Aristobulus. So again, we have figures who are Jewish in these positions. And I want to say a little bit about why why Jews would have been ambitious, presumably, to attain these positions. I think we can fairly assume that Jews needed channels of influence in this difficult and often dangerous world. They need channels of influence because they have to obtain protections. When there is no distinction between religious life and public life, and there was no distinction between religious life and public life in the ancient world, if you don't attend the festival of Dionysus, then you are a bad Greek. If you don't attend the festival of Jupiter, then you are a bad Roman. So when Jews are staying home from public festivals, they are the object of public resent and critique and accusations. What, you think you're better than us? You take all the advantages of living in our society and then you don't participate. You reject our ideals, you reject our claims, you reject our practices and our, our ideals, our values, etc. So very early on in the Hellenistic era, Jews are finding themselves to be the object of resentment and accusations of misanthropy. Misanthropia, of course, is a Greek word, which means anti-people, anti-person. So the Jews need channels of influence to obtain certain protections and permission to not attend these public festivals celebrating the god. Now, but there's an irony. And the irony is the more influence, you know exactly what I'm going to say, and it sounds very contemporary and very resonant. The more influence the Jews obtain,
More
the more,
suspicion.
exactly,
Yep.
exactly, the more they are critiqued, the more they are resented, the more they are marginalized, or one might even say demonized by some as being outsiders who are infiltrating society and then using improperly their influence. And then, ironically, the more protection the Jews need. So they find themselves in a very challenging cycle where they need protection. And then the more influence they get, the more they are accused of having undeserved power. I'm happy to stop there. I'm also happy to keep going.
Keep going. Keep going. This is
Okay,
really interesting.
I'll keep going. Um, Despite these difficulties, the Jews take great pride in being members of their broader societies. And I'm not talking about assimilated Jews. I'm not talking about Jews who are abandoning the observance of their ancestral laws. I'm talking about Jews who probably observed what we would call common Judaism. These are Jews who kept Shabbat, who kept kashrut, who practiced Brit Milah on their baby boys, who gathered regularly in synagogues to read the Torah and interpret the Torah. So these are practicing Jews who took pride in living in broader societies where they could contribute. And so the reason why I'm saying this is because there was an aspiration. I don't think it was actually a reality. I think it was an aspiration that Jews could successfully have some kind of dual loyalty and be accepted by their host empire and by their kin in Judea. This is the challenge of diaspora Judaism, is, you know, triangulating these two relationships, the relationship with their host empire and the relationship with their kin in the land of Israel. And the way that Jews outside the land of Israel express their hope that they could achieve this dual loyalty, which really is such a difficult, if not impossible, tightrope to walk, the way that they express this aspiration is by producing biblical interpretations where they can look at past heroes and say, look, you see, those people did it. And the four main figures, I think, that are really subject to admiration in the Hellenistic era, and we find them mentioned over and over again in biblical interpretations, especially produced by Jews outside the land of Israel, is Abraham, Yosef, Moshe, and Daniel. These are four very important figures. And Yosef and Daniel in particular are heroes to the Jews who live outside the land of Israel, because they look at these stories and they say, oh, look at these great examples. I don't know that they had a phrase that's equivalent to dual loyalty, but look at Yosef, who was so beloved and admired by Egyptians, so trusted by Paro, and yet never sways, never veers from his devotion to his ancestral law. And of course, with Daniel, the same. So we have all this interesting literature, biblical interpretations and novellas, about these figures that essentially are making a claim about what Jews can do outside the land of Israel and how they are legitimate. So now I think I will stop, unless you want examples. And then I can keep going.
We would love examples.
You love examples. Okay,
Yes.
great. There's a fantastic writer named Artapanos. We don't know so much about him except that he is cited by church father Eusebius, and Eusebius talks about Artapanos's biblical interpretations. Artapanos was likely a Jew living in the 2nd century BCE who describes Abraham and the Abrahamic family as making extraordinary contributions to broader society. So, and also I should say Artapanos does the same thing with Moshe. So, for example, Artapanos argues or describes the way in which Abraham in Egypt befriends the Egyptian king and teaches him astrology. Now,
Right.
it's really fascinating because other biblical interpreters at the same time who think astrology is idolatrous say Abraham fought against astrology. That's what Philo says. So a lot of this is kind of a mirror into the values of the writers. If you like astrology, then Abraham invented astrology. If you think it's bupkis, if you think it's a joke, then Abraham was combating it. Um, Abraham and again these other figures are really mirrors through which diaspora Jews can project the best of themselves. They become what we would call exempla, uh, embodiments of every virtue, every positive character trait. So Moshe is the ideal warrior for writers who admire physical prowess, a philosopher for the philosophical writers, and so on. Artapanos is just one example of this, and there are so many others.
So they used the characters from the Torah as like a way to teach didactic lessons based on, people are familiar with Moshe, so they explained kind of like their worldview through these characters.
Yeah, yeah. I'll just pull up a little line from Artapanos about Moshe. That, again, this is cited in Eusebius. He says, Moses, was the teacher of Orpheus. As a grown man, he bestowed many useful benefits on mankind. He invented boats and devices for stone construction, and the Egyptian arms, and the implements for drawing water, and for warfare, and philosophy. So, you can imagine Artapanos sitting there, with his papyrus, his stylus, or whatever, and he's looking around, he's seeing, maybe he's like on the coast of, he's in Alexandria, so he's seeing the island of Pharos, the lighthouse island. He's looking at the waters and he's seeing these boats and he's imagining the contributions of his Jewish ancestors in the same place or nearby, by the Nile. But then he just kind of tosses it all in, starting with the most specific, the boats and the devices. And then he's like, you know what? He just invented all of philosophy.
Mhm.
So it's one of my favorite lines in Artapanos because you see he's just getting increasingly ambitious as the sentence goes on.
So fascinating to see how they viewed everything, how they approached and related with the text, the Torah. It's so fascinating.
And they're
Like I
deep.
could I could see why you'd want to do this. It's really to be able to go through this stuff all day and to think about it and to write about it and to it's fascinating stuff.
It's just so fun. And it's fun, but it's also deeply important. Um, and I think that we make a mistake when we dismiss this literature as heretical or irrelevant. There are actually some fascinating examples of Second Temple traditions that are preserved in texts like Artapanos that then show up again in Midrashic tradition.
Mhm.
The famous image of baby Moshe on Paro's lap is one that is mentioned. It's a different version of it, but it's one that is mentioned in Josephus. And I think that's really significant because the Midrash, if you want to be an obnoxious academic about it, the Midrash that talks about that tradition was written and recorded and transmitted centuries after Josephus sat down and wrote his Antiquities of the Jews, which is in the 90 CE. And so for Josephus to be describing baby Moshe sitting on the lap of Paro and being tested by the courtiers who are threatened by him. And then it shows up in Shemot Rabbah. Well, the truth is, Shemot Rabbah is early medieval. It's really late. So when I look at Josephus and I say, wow, a very close version of this story was recorded by a first century Jew, my faith in the veracity and trustworthiness of these traditions are actually deeply enforced.
There's a continuity.
You know, there is, to be honest, there are also some interesting variations, and we should
Of
take this
course.
seriously. But yes, there is a continuity. Yeah.
Fascinating.
So interesting.
Benji, take it away.
Yeah, so in your chapter on sectarianism, you explain how sects were actually minority groups, as there was indeed a majority common strand within the Jewish people. Can you discuss what the majority of Israel looked like, how the minority sects interplayed within the majority, and the basic description of each of the sects?
Again, this is a huge question, and there are libraries worth of books, both on sectarianism in the Hellenistic world specifically, and also in terms of what I called earlier common Judaism. So I'll start with sectarianism because I think that when people are asked about Second Temple Judaism, very often their minds go straight to Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, the Dead Sea Scrolls. What we know, many of us, comes from collections of literature that represent a tiny, tiny percentage of Jews and Jewish thinking in the ancient world. So when we talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, we're not even talking about what were likely Essenes. We're talking about an extreme subset of the Essene community. And maybe in its heyday, the number of people who lived on the northwestern corner of the Dead Sea at Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, maybe it was 150. So we can't exactly know how many Jews were living in the second and first centuries BCE and the first century CE, but we know it was a whole lot more than 150 Jews. It was probably over 1 million Jews. So we have to be very careful when we talk about sectarianism. Josephus does give us the numbers. Josephus says that there were 6,000 Pharisees, 4,000, I think 4,000 Essenes, and 3,000 Sadducees. Josephus is known to inflate his numbers. He's not walking around taking a census, counting Essenes and Sadducees and Pharisees. These are his estimations. He doesn't know exactly. I would venture to guess that maybe there were even fewer than that. If you're estimating 600 to 800,000 Jews in the land of Israel, even in Israel alone, you're talking about a very small percentage. Now, they have a high profile, so I don't want to discount their influence. The Sadducees were known to be priests who had administrative authority over the temple. The Pharisees, of course, are the antecedents of the rabbinic community, not exactly the rabbis, but certainly their predecessors. So these are teachers, these are people who are in the public eye, the public religious eye. These are important people, but they're not representing the majority. So what does it mean to be a Jew in the ancient world? How did you practice your Judaism? How did you show others that you were Jewish? And it's an especially pressing question when you want to understand Jewish life outside the land of Israel, where we don't even know of any Essenes or Sadducees and Pharisees. Those sectarian groups are really specific to the land of Israel. Now, Philo of Alexandria does talk about some other groups. He talks about the Therapeutae, a group of Jewish scholars who go out to the wilderness to study Torah and philosophy. That's not exactly a sect. You might call that more a tightly knit community. And we could talk about how to define a sect, but these are not people who are thinking about the end of days. They're not rejecting other groups of Jews on the basis of, fundamental disagreements. So we really don't think that sectarianism was a diasporan phenomenon. To be a practicing Jew in the ancient world, you absolutely do not need to be in a sect. What it meant, I think, for most Jews was to practice the three main identifying markers of Jewish practice in the ancient world, and that is Shabbat, Kashrut, Brit Milah. Now, on top of that, I always use this image of those are the ingredients in the cake, and the frosting, like what you see, the thing that enhances it, that's so important that you can't do without it. The frosting is the Torah. I don't even know if this is a good metaphor, but it's the metaphor that I use. The frosting is the Torah. The interpretation is the sprinkles. I don't know. I don't know. But in any case, the most important thing is the regular gathering together in synagogues and reading and interpreting the Torah. There are shuls in the Second Temple era. They are not, we don't think, places for normative prayer. And we can get into this question of, the Gemara and Brachos that talks about Abraham inventing Shacharit and Yitzhak inventing Mincha and so on. But in the Second Temple era, most likely, shuls were places where Jews gathered to read and interpret the Torah. There was prayer, but prayer was less normative. and this is a complicated question. There certainly was prayer in Qumran in the Dead Sea community, but maybe they didn't daven exactly like other observant Jews. But the main thing that you would do in a shul is read the Torah and interpret it. So there were things that you could do anywhere. You didn't have to be in proximity to the Beit HaMikdash. You didn't have to be in proximity to Jerusalem or even live in the land of Israel. You didn't have to see the land of Israel for your entire life to practice as a Jew. You needed to have some access to studying the Torah, and people did that in synagogues.
So interesting. So the temple itself was already sort of not as central as it used to be. There's already kind of like a new identity that can be carved out that's not so temple dependent in that of Brit Milah, Shabbat, and Kashrut, and the gathering for the synagogue and reading the Torah and interpreting and that kind of. So we're looking at like the beginning stages of the shift away from the temple focus.
It's a really, really good question, and I agree that we're shifting away in the sense that there is a reality on the ground, and the reality is that the majority of Jews do not live in proximity to the temple, but the temple retains its centrality in Jewish literature. And again, I think that you could find later parallels with this in rabbinic texts and in medieval Jewish texts. And so the temple in Jewish literature is really, really important. And it's more than just the literature. There are tens of thousands of Jews, if not more, who are making the pilgrimage to Jerusalem on the holidays.
Of course.
We know this. We've got so much evidence for this, both in terms of the text, but also in terms of the archaeological evidence. We've got pedestrian roads leading to Jerusalem. So we know that Jews were going to make the pilgrimage. What's so interesting to my mind is that they know how to get there. They have their, they don't have Waze, but they have their maps. They know how to go, and then they go back home. We don't have any evidence of a mass of a mass migration of Jews to the land of Israel, as far as I know. But Jerusalem is very important to them. The temple is very important to them, but it's different because they don't feel that they need to worship in the temple in order to kind of actualize themselves as practicing Jews.
I understand. It's yes. The way I phrased it might have. Yeah, I didn't mean to take it to that extreme. Of course, yes. The temple was still a huge part, and uh, I was just trying to make note of like how would you feel as a Jew without the temple, and kind of the way you answered it with what they focused on. And I
Right.
feel like today we're kind of in the same boat, no? I mean, for the most part, how do you know that a person takes his religion, Judaism seriously if we're not going to get into labels, which I hate labels, like,
Mhm.
Orthodox. I'm not into that. But like you see a guy keeping kashrut, keeping Shabbat, you understand the guy takes his, like there, that speaks very much today as much as I think it did back then as to like the choices of which we choose to kind of like show our Jewish identity. Am I on the right track maybe?
I think you're absolutely on the right track. To me, this is all very resonant. There's lots of conversation today about who has the right to say things about the state of Israel and what happens in Israel and the Jews in Israel. And there's all kinds of controversies about what authority Jews in the diaspora should have when it comes to Israel. Those same conversations were happening in the ancient world, in both directions. We have some really interesting texts, some letters that I actually discuss in my more recent book that come from Jerusalem and are sent to very prominent Jews in Egypt, where they're essentially making the point that religious authority comes and always will come from the land of Israel. Doesn't matter how wealthy you are, doesn't matter how pious you are, doesn't matter how well regarded you are, you're in Egypt. So authority simply cannot come from there.
Excellent. Excellent.
And
Thank you for
before we move on to the next question, you did touch upon like one part that I was interested in. which is that there was like a group, let's say, of maybe like a small community of people who would go to the forest and study philosophy, right, or go to the wilderness.
Therapy.
What makes that, why do they not get considered as a sect? Like, what is it that defines a group as a sect?
It's a great question. Um, the subject of how to define a sect is not widely agreed upon. In other words, there are debates about how to understand a sect. I really appreciate and recommend Al Baumgarten's book on sectarianism, which which takes this question head on. Now, and John Collins has written about it as well. Now, I would say a very a very extreme definition of how to define sectarianism is to say you are in a sect when you believe that your community most fully and authentically embodies the true Israel.
Mm,
Now, the members of Qumran, of the Dead Sea sect, again, we're living this out in the most extreme way. We know from their literature that they believe that outsiders were not members of the polity of Israel. In other words, they wouldn't enjoy the same blessings in the end time. They were keeping the wrong calendar. The Qumran community kept a solar calendar, and so they are literally claiming that outsiders are eating on Yom Kippur. You know, if you think about how important a calendar was in the ancient world, if everyone is keeping a different calendar, you're the only one who's properly observing Yom Kippur. So that's an extreme, that's kind of the limit case of sectarianism, to say we are the true Israel and all of you, you're actually not. You are not embodying, you are not inheriting those covenantal promises. We are. Now, there are more nuanced levels, I suppose, of sectarianism where you might say, well, we are fully and most properly living out the task that was given to us in the covenantal relationship, and so we are kind of at the center of the polity of Israel. The therapeutae, the stakes are lower and the boundaries are looser. I think that in terms of the rules of entry, it was much more relaxed. Again, we only know about the therapeutae from Philo, so
mm,
we also have to be careful to when you only have one source, you have to
right,
be uh, a little bit more gentle in your claims.
right.
But these are people who just had a passion for learning, for Torah study, for philosophy. They were in community with each other. And Philo has a lot of disdain for city life. He feels that it distracts and corrupts. And a lot of intellectuals in the ancient world did have a disdain for city life. So if you wanted to live a life of the mind, there was an ideal to get out of the city, to get away from those material distractions. And so the notion that these Jews who were probably financially comfortable and had the luxury to be able to do this, the idea that they went out into the wilderness to study Torah, this was considered to be very, very admirable. Is it a sect? Are they making a claim that they and only they are the recipients of divine beneficence in a way that separates them from the rest of world Jewry? I don't think so. I wouldn't take it that far.
Yeah, what's interesting to me always is that you hear, for example, like, okay, based on your description right now, then you could consider Christianity, at least early on, is a sect.
Right.
But like, for example, the Samaritans are never thrown into that category for some reason. You don't hear like the Essenes, the Sadducees, and like they're already considered out, beyond the pale. So I'm just curious to know why that distinction is made. Maybe there is no, maybe I'm just wrong about this, but I'm just curious to know why.
That's really interesting. I don't know why the Samaritans would not be considered a sect. I would defer to someone who is really a scholar of the Samaritans. Maybe there's an answer on that question that I don't know. To me, it's more of like a religious branch. Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to have to defer it
Good.
because I
Okay.
don't have the answer.
All right. All right. So Ben's take the next one.
All right. So, in your chapter, Expanding the Bible, you give us a tour of the fascinating documents we have found from that period, which expand the Bible, the Testaments being a great example. Can you tell us about some of the most important Testaments and other documents? What was the likely reason they were written, and how these Testaments evolved into the time of Chazal?
This is my favorite part, by the way.
You can only say that after I answer because I might give you a really dry and boring answer.
I
I
got
hope
it.
that I don't.
I
There's
got it.
just so much. There's so many texts that I want to tell you about, but you specified the Testaments, and so I'll tell you about the Testaments. This is a genre of literature. It actually becomes very important in early Christian tradition. But it starts, we think, in Jewish literary circles at the end of the Second Temple era. A testament is a document. We find them first written in Aramaic, actually, and then mostly later in Greek. A testament is a text that recalls the wisdom imparted to one's children and grandchildren on a deathbed. And so this is a very, very popular mode of writing. And we find it in the context of Yaakov's 12 sons. So the very earliest testaments that we find are found at Qumran, found at the Dead Sea Caves, and they're scraps of the Testament of Naphtali, and I believe as well the Testament of Levi. I'm pretty sure we have as well in Aramaic. What ends up happening is that probably multiple writers added to these early texts, so that by the first century CE, we have a collection that becomes known as the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. I know how Christian this sounds. I don't mean that offensively, but when we talk about testaments, it's not a word in the Jewish lexicon. And so it does sound kind of foreign, the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. That's why it's so important to emphasize that we have these Aramaic documents, and we don't have a full collection of the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs in Aramaic, but we do think that pretty early on, let's say by the end of the first century, there's a collection of these speeches of the 12 sons of Yaakov. What did they say on their deathbeds? We think that they are kind of completely composed and collected as one unit by the first century, by the end of the first century in Greek. In other words, these texts were circulating and being transmitted and shared in Aramaic, and at some point Jews start to translate them into Greek or write new ones in Greek. Unfortunately, what ends up happening is that in the second and third centuries, editors who are Christian are copying these documents onto new manuscripts, and they're interpolating references to Jesus and the Trinity into their editions. And so by the time you get to the medieval era, the manuscripts of the Testaments, I don't want to say the word corrupted, but they present as Christian texts. I'm not the only historian who would say these texts were very likely originally written by Jews. And it's not only that we have Aramaic scraps of them found at Qumran, but there are really interesting allusions to Jewish law that are not fully excised from the text. So for example, I believe it's in the Testament of, oh no, I think it's Shimon. I think it's Shimon that talks about the mourning laws of the Jews, Mourning, the mourning laws of the Jews, that the people, that his descendants, I don't want to say this because I don't have it in front of me. I don't know who they are mourning. Are they mourning Shimon, or are they mourning someone else? But in any case, there's a reference to those laws. Now, what laws? We don't know, because this text would have predated rabbinic documents about Avelut. So what are they talking about? We don't know. We've got little golden nuggets, little references to practices that would have been transmitted orally, because we don't have legal codes at this early stage. We don't have a lot of halachic literature. We have a little bit, actually, again, from Qumran, but we don't have a lot. So the Testaments are very serious texts. They have a lot of ethical content, and they're catered towards the biblical story. So we find fascinating biblical interpretation within them. For example, in the Testament of Yehuda, we have references to the story of Tamar, and in that testament, chastity and propriety is highlighted. In the testament of Yosef, we have other values that are highlighted that correlate with his life as it is told in Bereshit. So these were written by very close readers of the text, and I want to be clear again, I don't read these texts as heretical or as sloppy or as disrespectful. I think that this was the highest level of homage and reverence that you could pay in the ancient world. In other words, there's a playful element and there's a creative element in these texts, but there's also extraordinary reverence and love for the biblical account. So I don't think that these testaments are in any way trying to replace Bereshit or the scriptures in general, nor are they presenting themselves as authoritative, as scriptural.
Mm.
I think it's pretty clear that these texts are not that. And so, if you want to call it proto midrashic, you can, but I think that they come from a place of respect.
So yeah, I totally see it as proto-midrashic. What I'd like to know is, you mentioned that over time there were, kind of like Christian attachments to these testaments, but is there a way we can, let's say, learn these things today in their original form, and how much of the original is actually intact?
Honest.
Um, in English editions of the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, you will really struggle to find that kind of ur text, that original Jewish version, because the English editions are translated from manuscripts that were either written in Greek or in Ge'ez, in an Ethiopic language, or other languages that in turn derive from the Greek. So the process of discerning what is Jewish, what is a later interpolation, is really fraught. I don't recommend it. I think that this can become very circular. If you decide, oh, a certain feature is Christian, then every time you find that feature, you'll say it's Christian and vice versa. Oh, it's a law, that must be Jewish. Oh, it's ethical, that must be Christian. You can get very speculative very fast. That is why the scraps from Qumran are so important, because they're early.
Mm.
Another way to enter into this question is to look for citations of the testaments, but unfortunately we have very few, because by the second century, like I said, it's entering into the Christian imagination, and I think at some point rabbinic writers say, you know what, you can have those. There is this kind of what we call the parting of the ways, where there are certain texts that do have a Jewish origin, but because they become so central to Christian communities, the rabbis sort of let them go.
Interesting. There was one of the Second Temple literature books you talked about, that featured Avraham and how he kept all the Torah. What was the name of that one? I don't remember offhand.
Are you talking about the Testament of Abraham, which is
Testament of Abraham. That's okay.
my favorite text, my favorite? I could talk about it all day. I think
Please,
Yeah,
that's very
I've actually
interesting.
I've heard you talk about it. I think it was either on Orthodox Conundrum or 1840. Like, it was probably a few years ago, but it was so entertaining. So we would love to hear about it if you don't mind.
I'm always worried about repeating myself on podcasts because I don't want to bore people and I don't want to say the same thing. So I'm always thinking in advance of a podcast, okay, what can I say that I've never said before? This is something that bothers me, and so I appreciate that you're inviting me to be repetitive. That's very gracious of you. And I guess I don't know if I should apologize to listeners if I'm going to bore
Absolutely
them,
not.
but this is just so it's just so fun. I should have I should have gotten the text next to me. Is it okay? Can I take
Please
10 seconds to grab
go
it?
ahead. Yeah, yeah, of course.
Okay, hold on one second. Thanks.
I love how she's so into it.
Great.
Okay, I got it now.
All right.
All right. So there were Jews, there were Jewish writers in the ancient world who had really great senses of humor. And the writer of the Testament of Abraham was one of them. This is a writer who knows very intimately the genre of the Testaments and wants to subvert the genre. The genre is
Yeah.
very serious.
Yeah, you mentioned that. So it's very serious. And this one, I remember this now. It's a comedy.
It's a
So
comedy.
it's very interesting. Yeah.
It's a comedy because everything that you expect to happen doesn't happen. And so that kind of element of surprise makes it shocking and funny. We know from the biblical tradition that Abraham is a trusting servant of God. Yes, it's true. He argues with God in Bereshit Yud Tet in Genesis 19 with the story of Sodom. But he's doing so out of integrity, out of a love for humankind, out of a sincerity, a sense of brotherhood, forgiveness, right? Abraham is pious. I think we could all agree on that. Abraham is a pious servant of God. There's a reason why he's chosen by God. And of course, the paradigmatic example is in Bereshit Chafet with the Akedah. Now, whoever wrote this book wanted to surprise and shock his readers by depicting Abraham as just an utter doofus. And so what he does is he uses the Testament genre to say, I'm going to tell you a story where everything goes wrong, and you're going to think you're getting a story of Abraham's testament. In other words, Abraham is about to die, and so the reader is going to expect solemn, ethical wisdom, the greatest insights to be imparted, inspirational, right? Because it's Abraham. He's the most important of all the patriarchs, of all the heroes in the Bible. And instead, we have a story where Abraham is about to die and he refuses to. So the truth is, I haven't looked at this in a long time, but the story opens up with God sending Michael, the archangel Michael, to earth to gently bring Abraham into the heavens. God loves Abraham so much, he wants him to have a gentle death. A death maybe that is similar to the death of Aaron or Eliyahu, but a gentle death. And so Michael, the archangel Michael, goes to Abraham and says, all right, Abraham, your time has come. I'm here to take you into the world to come, to take you into this, this new existence. You're going to die. And what we have afterwards is a series of comedies in which Abraham maneuvers out of Michael's way to evade death. And so Michael says, your time has come, and Abraham says, that's great. I'll be right back. And he kind of like slips out the back of his tent. This keeps happening. Michael keeps trying to get Abraham to come with him. Abraham is like pretending to be on board, but absolutely will not go near him. Michael gets so desperate and frustrated that he goes back to heaven. He's like, God, I can't. Like, he is such a pain, and I can't do it. And so God is like, all right, you know what? You're doing your best, but clearly you're not to the task. I'm going to send the angel of death. And the book ends with the angel of death tricking Abraham into touching him, and Abraham dies. But before that happens, Abraham gives Michael a series of false promises. If you do X, I'll go with you. And then Michael does X, and then Abraham's like, actually, I'm not going to. And so one of the things that Abraham says is, I'll go with you. I'll go into heaven, but you need to first take me on a chariot ride over all of humankind, because I want to see what's going on in the world. And so they go on this chariot ride, and they see all these terrible things. This is the climax of the book. Before Michael gives up on Abraham and goes back and says, you got to send the angel of death, Abraham is still kind of leading Michael along and saying, like, I'm with you. Here's another thing you got to do. Here's another thing you got to do. So at one point, Abraham asks for this chariot over the heavens. They go in the chariot and they glide over the earth, and they're observing humankind. And what do they see? They see sin after sin after sin. They're looking down, and in one place a man is committing adultery, and another place someone is stealing, and another place someone is murdering. And every time Abraham looks below and sees more debauchery and criminal activity, Abraham says, Michael, you got to kill that person. He's sinning. You got to do something. And Michal's like, wait a second. Like, I thought you were Abraham, the pious, generous. And everyone's like, no, stop it with that. Like, no, you got to kill this guy. And so Michal's like, I don't know. So Michael, because he has these special angelic abilities, is like throwing, is like zapping these sinners below. And after a while, Avram is like instructing Michal to kill these sinners. After a while, God intervenes. Basically, a voice comes out from heaven and says, all right, stop the chariot ride. This is getting out of control. If you let Abraham keep going like this, he's going to destroy all of humankind. And Michal is like, I thought you'd never say that. This has been terrible for me. And so that's how the chariot ride ends. I mean, it just goes on and on with these various misadventures. Avraham leading Michael, along through this kind of just endlessly frustrating, epic, epic story. So the Testament of Abraham, like, what in the world is this book about? First of all, well, I'm curious to know what you think, but
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
no, I just it seems like almost like a Torah fan fiction that was written at the
Yeah,
time. Like it's just they're just having a good time with it, you know?
right. So
Love the
fan
book.
fiction for sure. That's a phrase that I love. Look, this is not authoritative. This is not sacred. I don't think. I don't think it was read as sacred text or not even close to canonical. I don't think that this was a text that was read with reverence. There is a kind of a teasingness of, oh, you think Abraham was so perfect. You think that these biblical heroes were, flawless. Let me tell you what, you know, what would have been if Abraham was really tested. So I think that this is a story for entertainment, but it plays with pietistic themes, and throughout the work, you can see words and phrases and sometimes full verses being lifted off from the Tanakh. In other words, whoever wrote this was deeply intimate with the Torah. And you can like literally go through line by line and see where there are quotations, allusions, references, not just to Sefer Bereshit, but to Shemot, to Yechezkel, because there's this kind of angelic chariot scene, to other parts of Tanakh. So here's someone who's like probably going to shul, probably getting some kind of formal Jewish education, knows how to practice their traditions and knows their scriptural stories, and yet at the same time produces a text that is, totally irreverent.
He's voicing his inner doubts.
So right. There is a serious question here. You want to say more?
He's what's the things that, I mean, like you said, he's very much connected with the text, so he's not only familiar with it but deeply entrenched in it. And we can see that by the amount of verses and themes that he's putting in and playing with. But from what you were saying, it seems like he has a hard time. He has a hard time with certain theological aspects of piety, and like the feeling I was getting was he was kind of in a manner of comedy, but in also but sort of like expressing his inner perplexities, complexities, or however you'd want to call it.
So I think that's true. So I think that the book is struggling with theodicy. This is the question of why do good people suffer and why do good people die. Abraham doesn't accept
Oh, okay.
it.
That's a point I didn't. Aha. So this is specific to the question of why do good things happen to bad people? Why do
I
bad things happen to good people?
I think Abraham is a very powerful moral voice here. He's protesting God and he's saying, look, these people are sinning. They need to be punished. You can't let bad people get away with things. And hey, I'm a good person. I've listened to you all my life. Now you're chasing me across the earth, trying to get me to die. You're ignoring the debaucherer. You're ignoring the thief. You're ignoring all these people and you're chasing me. He's protesting against what he seems to be, he feels is a moral injustice. And he's kind of like a Job. And in my mind, this is an Eov kind of a story, but it's funny, right? There isn't an answer. I think that the questions here are deeply serious questions. Abraham expresses his fealty, his loyalty to his ancestral God, but he doesn't accept reality on the ground. And I think the message is that if you are pious, if you care about this, right? If you are loyal to God, if you are committed to your ancestral traditions, protest. These are questions that the writer doesn't have the answer to. And I think that he's projecting that difficulty onto Abraham, who is asking these very same questions. We are living in a world where good people do seem to suffer and bad people do seem to go unharmed. And Abraham doesn't like it. And he wants it to change. And God says, but what you don't understand is that if I ruled with justice, the world would be destroyed. And I have
He comes to his own solution via the story.
Yeah.
He comes to his own resolution, or one that he can live with at least.
and in the end, Abraham dies, right?
And I don't know if
In the
does.
end, he's not right. In the end, God doesn't say, you know what, that's a really good point. Here's another 40 years. No, he dies. Abraham doesn't win the argument. So what the author is doing is asking really serious questions. But honestly, who in the first century is reading Eov? I don't know. I don't know that your average, even observant Jew in the ancient world would
It's
stand
also a very difficult book in general. The
up.
language is very, very difficult. If you're not an educated Jew that knows, like, high level biblical Hebrew, you can't learn Eov.
And,
That's
and
exactly right.
and the level of subversion that the author is administering here is so interesting because he's taking the one character that is known for
Yeah,
arguing with God for the opposite, right?
exactly.
Saving lives.
Right.
Yeah, it's very smart.
Right. Not chesed, but justice,
Right,
essentially.
right.
Abraham becomes the voice for, a desire for justice. What's really interesting is that in the third or fourth century, Christians stopped reading this for entertainment and humor, and they produced a new version of it that was much more serious. And so later, as we move closer to the medieval era, there's a new version of the Testament of Abraham that's totally serious and pietistic and essentially was read in Christian communities as another testament. So it was stripped of the humor, and then it became this story that was actually very serious and doesn't have the kind of mocking tones and doesn't depict Michal as bumbling and clueless. So at some point, it became a serious book in Christian tradition.
Well, you know what? They got something right. You got to leave the comedy to the Jews,
Though, I'm kicking myself for not realizing the specific correlation to human suffering and the problem of human suffering. It's so obvious, right? When you said, I'm like, oh my God, yes, it's exactly what it's doing. But as you were explaining the whole thing, I went back to Rabbi Sachs. Rabbi Sachs, I think, was like on the topic of human suffering and why do good people suffer and why do I feel like he had the most refined response. You get a lot of answers, but then when it comes to Rabbi Sachs, he doesn't give you an answer. He gives you a channel from which to consider something, if you know what I mean. You know what I mean? He doesn't just say, here's an answer and gives like some technical reason or way to make it all work. He kind of just he opens up a discussion, and you mentioned protest, and that's exactly his whole point, right? Rabbi Sachs always said that the whole, like, we have to protest the idea that the good people suffer, we need to protest that as human beings. We shouldn't be satisfied with any theological technical answer that we can give. And then, like, as you were saying this, I was thinking to myself, like, that's exactly what he was doing. He was screaming he was protesting this basic question that was probably consuming him. And I just found it to be incredible.
Right, right. And what's interesting, I agree with all of that. And, as much as the writer, I think, really treats the Torah and Torah tradition with, I think, a kind of respect, I don't think he respects the Testament genre. I don't think that he liked the Testaments. If I had to guess, I think that he probably read speeches, very serious speeches, in the Testament of Reuven and the Testament of, whatever, Levi, and he probably said, you know what, these are so confident, these documents about how to live your life, and you will enjoy divine blessings and protection if you do X, Y, and Z. And he looked around and he said, that just doesn't resonate with me.
He's like polemicizing the testaments with a testament.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm going to write something else. And you know what? Maybe even Abraham would agree with me, right? There are good people in the world who suffer. Even Abraham saw that, right? Abraham saw that. We know that from the Torah. And we don't have to accept it, right? We could be the moral voice, even if we know the answer is going to be, you just don't get it. You're a mere mortal. Even if the answer is going to be, you could use a little humility, but still we can ask the question.
Yep,
I think the theme,
exactly.
I think the interesting connection to Eov also is that in the tradition, there's also this idea that Avraham is the author of Sefer Eov.
Oh,
Yeah. And
Yes,
yeah,
I didn't think about
yeah,
that.
yeah.
I didn't
And
either.
either it's about that he wrote it, or there's something about his life that there's certain values that are connected to Abraham. So I
There's
think
intertextual links,
there's
by the way,
intertextual
too.
links.
Yep.
Exactly. There's intertextual links. So
Yeah.
I think that that's probably why the author chose to use theodicy as his focus here. It's interesting.
Very fascinating. That is really interesting.
Pure speculation, obviously. Very cool, very cool. That was so enjoyable. So, before we
It
wrap
really
it
was.
up, we'd love for our listeners to get a taste of your latest work, Letters from Home. Could you tell us briefly what the book is about, what inspired it, and what kind of conversation you hope it'll spark?
Thank you for asking about Letters from Home. It was published in summer of 2024, and the book essentially addresses the question of what was the Israel diaspora relationship like in the ancient world? How did Jews within and without the land of Israel think about each other? And the core argument of the book is that diaspora is a category that is invented by Jews in the land of Israel. The word diaspora is very, very rare. We only find it 15 times in all of surviving Second Temple literature. And it seems to me that most or all of those times derive from the land of Israel or were written by people with close ties to the land of Israel. The notion that there's a meaningful category that designates all of Jewish life outside the land of Israel, and that category has a particular theological meaning that is negative, is a Judean idea. Jews in the actual diaspora, and I say diaspora there with quotation marks, do not use the word or think with the category, and in fact make the argument that Jewish life outside the land of Israel is is making a contribution to humankind that Jews in the land cannot make by
Mm.
bringing knowledge of the universal God to the foreign nations. So part of what the book does is it traces the development of the word diaspora, links it to Judean way of thinking, and says, well, actually, we take this word to be kind of self-evident of a particular reality, but the category of diaspora was contested from the time that it was invented.
That is fascinating.
Thank
Yeah, and
you.
we hope to do a separate podcast on that book in a future time. And we just wanted to, first of all, sing your praises. We think that you are such an important voice in the Jewish world because there's not many women, especially, who do what you do, and it takes a lot of courage.
Thank you.
It's also something like I would hope for my own daughters to, pursue such a career, because of course it's not so simple, being an Orthodox Jew and getting involved in this stuff. So we really appreciate it. We think you're awesome, and we hope that we keep getting more and more great content from you, more great books, and wishing you the best.
That is so gracious. Thank you very much for those kind words, and thank you for having me on.
We
Pleasure.
appreciate it. Thank you so much. Keep up the good work.
Thank you. You too. You too. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.